celebrating 35 years of Hello, I'm Joe, this is Same Name Different Game, and welcome to the Capcom Chronology, a summer series in which myself and my pal, Roger the Retro Gaming Puppet, will be looking at our favorite third-party game developer of all time. We'll be looking at games from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation, while at the same time taking in the history of Capcom's precipitous rise. So let's get started by doing just that. Not with a little, but a lot of history. We're going all the way back on this one, folks. Kenzo Tsujimoto was born in Nara, Japan in 1940. When he was only 15 years old, his father died, forcing him to work at his family's food wholesaling business while continuing school part-time. When he turned 22, he struck out on his own. At 26, he moved to Osaka and opened a confectionery supply store, selling stuff like cotton candy making machines. In 1969, Tsujimoto started selling electromechanical games out of his store in addition to candy equipment. In 1974, he established a company called IPM to manufacture and distribute electromechanical amusements, and starting in 1978, make video games. IPM is still around after a fashion. You might know them as IREM. In 1980, a Japanese electronics company called Nanao purchased controlling interest in IREM, though Tsujimoto continued running the company. The year prior, in 1979, he'd started a little side hustle called IRM, not to be confused with IREM, in Osaka, a separate company distributing arcade and electromechanical games. During his time running IREM under Nanao, the Japan Capsule Computer Company was established as a subsidiary of his newer company. Whether it's because he was too focused on that company or some other reason, I can't say, but in 1982, the folks at Nanao decided Tsujimoto wasn't a good fit and ousted him, with the president of the parent company taking over as head of IREM. Seems like Tsujimoto just wasn't made to work for someone else, and 35 years ago this very month, in June of 1983, Capcom was established as a subsidiary of IRM Corporation, by that time known as Sanbi, and they manufactured their first game, an electromechanical baseball game called Little League. A year later, in 1984, they released their first arcade video game, Vulgus. And Tsujimoto continues to run the company to this day as CEO. Capcom is well and truly a family business, with his sons holding various posts, including, for example, Haruhiro Tsujimoto as Chief Operating Officer, and Ryozo Tsujimoto as the producer of the Monster Hunter games. From the beginning, Capcom set out to make the best games they could in the arcade. Kenzo Tsujimoto talks even now about fostering an environment of creativity at Capcom to create games that players will enjoy. And since the early days, they've done just that. By 1985's end, the company had already released 1942, Ghosts and Goblins, and Commando into arcades, all games establishing franchises that would go on for at least 2 decades. In April of 1986, the company released a less remembered game, one that did not go on to spawn a line of sequels. Distributed in the US by Romstar, it's our first game for this episode, Trojan, otherwise known as Tatakai no Banka, roughly translated Elegy for Battle or Requiem for Battle. I'm playing it on the Capcom Arcade Cabinet Collection from Retro Revival Masters M2 on the PlayStation 3, though it is also available on the Xbox 360. Trojan was designed by Takashi Nishiyama, who would go on to direct Street Fighter, then have a hand in multiple King of Fighters, Fatal Fury, and Metal Slug titles before returning to Capcom as a producer on Street Fighter 4, and Tomoshi Sadamoto, who is credited with creating the parry system for Street Fighter 3, and now works with the younger Tsujimoto on Monster Hunter games. It was programmed by Yoichi Egawa, who is still with Capcom, but now in an executive role. So with all that pedigree, this game must be pretty dope, right? Well, sadly, not really. Don't get me wrong, it's a very cool looking game, calling to mind the post-apocalypse of Mad Max, but with swords. It's almost like Into the Badlands, but like 30 years before that show was on. The problem, however, is in the difficulty curve. This game is a pure quarter muncher. You step into the shoes of the titular Trojan as he makes his way across the wasteland to kill the evil Achilles, who has set his evil hordes on the people of this land. Trojan uses two buttons, one to swing your sword and one to raise your shield. Jumping is done by hitting up on the joystick. You can also guard in several directions using the joystick, but this makes jumping and guarding simultaneously a bit of an ordeal. You can also lose your sword and shield from certain enemy attacks, leaving you to fend off enemy barbarians with only fists and feet. The big problem is that the game sets a ton of enemies on you, many of whom are considerably more mobile than our hero, and a few of whom can do massive amounts of damage to him. Regular enemies can be a pain, and even mid-stage bosses can be brick walls. The first stage boss has greater reach and does more damage than the hero, and this makes the most effective strategy just trading hits with him since you swing faster, and hopefully get him before he gets you. This remains an effective strategy for a disappointing number of bosses, and becomes a problem when they start throwing two bosses from earlier stages at you later in the game. Another problem is that Trojan moves faster when jumping, and moving faster prevents being ganged up on, so in many stages the most effective strategy is to just jump through the level as fast as you can. When the player wants to bound through your game as quickly as possible, that might indicate a problem with it. Still, the soundtrack by Ayako Mori, who also did the Ghosts and Goblins music, is super catchy. The aesthetics are cool, and generally the game has enough charm to keep you pulled in for a couple of plays, before you inevitably give up out of frustration midway through the 6 stages. Now, let's talk about Capcom and their early days with home systems. In those early years, Capcom didn't have a home development division, and simply farmed out their home ports or licensed them to other publishers to translate to home computers. But they did get a license to publish games on the Nintendo Famicom, and shortly thereafter, on its worldwide counterpart, the NES. Most folks remember those early NES Capcom games, partially for the rad laser grid boxes that promised state-of-the-art, high-resolution graphics, and partially because the first handful weren't good. Those early games, 1942 and Ghosts and Goblins, aren't remembered terribly fondly thanks to the slapdash work of Micronix, a shadow developer rumored to be just one or maybe two people. Here in North America, we were spared their efforts on the NES ports of Sun Sun and Exit X's, aka Savage Bees. But that does bring us to our next game for this episode, Trojan on NES. Trojan was the first home port developed in-house by Capcom. There are two ports, actually, a largely forgotten DOS port that doesn't scroll, and one that I'm honestly dubious was actually developed by Capcom. And then, what's probably the best known version of this game, the NES title. But I digress. Capcom would eventually be known for releasing very different versions of their arcade games on the NES, with titles like Bionic Commando and Strider. But Trojan is a fairly faithful port, including Ayako Mori's score being pretty much entirely intact. And though the visuals aren't what the publisher would eventually attain on the platform, it looks pretty good, especially for a relatively early NES title. In a way, it presages the path Capcom's NES titles would take. For example, the jump pads seen in the arcade are now gone, and replaced with power-up boots that let our hero super jump anywhere he wants when he has them. These are sometimes found by entering sewers or other hidden areas not in the arcade version and defeating certain enemies. A couple of the levels have also changed. The back half of Stage 2 is completely different, adding this marsh that Trojan has to navigate. Unfortunately, stage changes aren't always for the better, and Stage 5 is basically cut in half. The game also adds a new boss not seen in the arcade. This dude with the ball and chain. But there are smaller changes too, changes that stack up to make this game more manageable than its arcade counterpart. First, very possibly due to hardware limitations, you just aren't as surrounded here as you are in the original. But more than that, many of the sticking points in the arcade are seen when you have to take on multiple big bads at one time, and those are addressed in a couple ways. Take Iron Arm, for example. In the arcade game, he can swing high or low, rapidly, and block your attacks. Here on the NES, he can still swing high or low, but his arm actually detaches from him, and he has to wait for it to come back before attacking again, leaving an opening for Trojan. Muscular, yeah, that's his real name, Muscular, is changed even more. In the arcade, he can swing high or low, and like Iron Arm, very quickly. In the NES game, he swings twice before resting and can only swing high. This leaves openings for Trojan to hit and jump out, which are almost non-existent in the arcade game. Unfortunately, this swings a little too far. Achilles, the final boss, is one of the few bosses to be reasonably balanced in the arcade game, requiring quick movement and diligent shield use. But in the NES game, he becomes a chump, and he goes down very easily. Despite that, I found this version's difficulty preferable to the original. Ultimately, the NES version overcorrects on the difficulty curve. I only needed one continue to finish it, whereas the arcade took me dozens, if not hundreds. And that's no exaggeration. But it's about that time, so let's go ahead and take a look and a listen to these side by side. The arcade game certainly looks better, but as I said previously, the NES game looks great for a fairly early game on the platform. As for sound, the arcade game sounds very good, but I have a soft spot for the NES sound chip and honestly think it sounds a little bit better. And that makes it time to give the edge. And for me, it's the NES version. Yeah, it's a little too easy, but that beats the absolute frustration of the arcade game. It's also cheap. It's one of the most common NES games out there, and I absolutely would not pay more than $5 for a bare cart. But as is so often the case with these summer series I like to do, it's not really about which game is better, it's about the history. And for the next obscure old games, Roger the Retro Gaming Puppet has some history for you. A Capcom NES game so obscure, it was never even released. And come back in July for another same name, different game, where I will be rounding out Capcom's 8-bit history and taking a look at one of their very first arcade ports of the 16-bit era. I want to thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you then.
What happened? It's out of control! 悪は俺が裁く。なんちゃって戦いの番か。武芸百般なんでもござれの君なら勝てる。隠れキャラや隠しステージ、アイテムもぐーんと増えて面白いんだって。ファミコンソフト戦いの番か、カプコンから